Hello, friends. Welcome back to another episode of Even the Sparrow. This is the podcast where you are invited to come just as you are and empowered to leave encouraged by the Word of God. We have our Bible right here. And by a sister in Christ who is myself, who loves to talk all things faith, food freedom, body image, disordered eating, and everything in between. If this is the first time that you've seen me before or been to the podcast, I am so excited to have you, and you are so welcome to be here. Please stick around. I'm excited that you decided to tune in. And my name is Nicole. I always forget to actually introduce myself. My name is Nicole Wu. I'm a registered dietitian, a non-diet food freedom registered dietitian specifically, and a follower of Jesus, a daughter of God. And I love talking all things nutrition and Jesus and wellness and health through the lens of God, because this is a conversation that God is very much a part of. And we see so much about wellness and health and these wellness trends and these diet trends on social media that, oh God, if you're not watching, Noelle just hopped on the back of my chair. Anyways, it can be just so hard to discern what you should do, what you shouldn't do, when everything is so loud telling you differing things about what to do with food and what to do with your nutrition and your health online. But God is the creator of you and food and your body, and He knows how these things work and how they were intended to be. So I love bringing this conversation onto a podcast. Today, I am talking about something that I've gone back and forth on speaking on the podcast about, because it is such a heightened topic in our society and on the online space. People have so many opinions on it, and they have very strong opinions on it. But I'm not called to be soft or sugarcoat things on this podcast. That's not what God wants me to do. I'm here to share the truth. I'm here to share my educated opinions as well that the Lord equipped me with. And so we're talking about the topic of processed foods. We're going to get into these buzzwords of toxic chemicals. We're going to talk about the claims of why there are certain ingredients that are banned in other countries, but that the US uses in our food. So I don't want to shy away. I want to get into it, and I want to talk about it, number one, from a very scientific, research-based lens of what we have available to us on these topics. But number two, I really want to talk about how we can approach this topic through the lens of how we are to live out our lives as followers of Jesus. So how are we supposed to respond to this conversation as followers of Christ, as Christian women? That's what we're going to end today on. So first, let's get into the research, and let's actually really talk about ultra-processed foods. Get comfortable, enjoy your walk with me in your ears. I'm honored to be here for you. And let's just get into it. So first, let's kind of define what we're talking about here. So in reality, the word processed, when we're talking about processed foods, actually accounts for any changes or processes that a food undergoes to be altered in any way, shape, or form. So this can actually include things like washing your produce, frying, cooking, baking, grilling. That's all considered processing. So I want to make that very clear. This term is, number one, used very, very loosely on the internet, when in reality, most of the things that we eat are processed. But we are going to talk about the buzz around what we call ultra processed foods, the foods that people are probably talking about, like packaged foods and, snack foods, chips, crackers, frozen foods, things like that. Now that we understand a little bit more about what we're talking about when we talk about processed or ultra processed foods, let's talk about the research that we do have around the consumption of ultra-processed foods and the risk of developing diseases. So when I say diseases, this can include things like diabetes, high blood pressure, high cholesterol, heart disease, cancers, things like that is usually what we are accounting for when we say increased risk of disease, or what these articles are usually accounting for. So while if we do take a look at some of the available research on the association of ultra-processed foods and disease development, they do conclude that there is an association between higher consumption of ultra-processed foods and a higher risk of disease development. Most of these studies, they do acknowledge some major limitations in this evidence. So when we talk about limitations to the evidence, these are other factors that we have to consider in order to conclude whether we can actually apply this research to our care. And so in this case, is it necessary to recommend cutting out ultra-processed foods because we know, sorry if my rings clicked, because we know this increases disease development? Can we actually, with confidence, apply that statement? So the number one limitation that I've seen acknowledged in the studies that we have available is that the term ultra-processed foods doesn't have a very specific defined definition. So this leads the question to what foods actually fall into this category, because there are a wide range of foods that are considered ultra-processed foods, some with more nutrients than others. So for example, the nutrient composition of a pack of Oreos, which are my favorite by the way, versus the nutrient composition of maybe a granola with some nuts and seeds or a fortified cereal, that is very different. Like the Oreo probably isn't fortified with a bunch of nutrients that we necessarily need, but things like granola or these cereals might be fortified or include a lot of micronutrients that our bodies do need. And so we can see that there is a vast variety of foods that fall into this category of being ultra processed that we need to take into consideration. And so because ultra processed foods is a very vague term, it is very difficult to necessarily study and have very solid, conclusive results or things to acknowledge from the evidence. There are a lot of gray areas that make the research quality not super solid, but not to say it needs to be disregarded. I think that there is a lot of research on it, and so it is important to consider the research, but we have to be careful as to whether we need to conclude that correlation equals causation in this case, meaning because we're seeing higher disease and higher intake of ultra-processed foods, that means that the foods are the cause of the disease. I hope that makes sense. But we can't conclude that. We absolutely cannot conclude that correlation between the two equals the causation. With that being said as well, another major limitation that we have to consider are the biases that are involved in the available research. So a ton of research on the ultra-processed foods, I was able to see that there were conflicts of interest because there are studies in research that have certain companies or organizations that help fund the research to happen with hope for a particular outcome so that they can promote their agenda. So there are lots of biases that we can consider in the research as well. Again, not to completely disregard the research that we have available. I think there are things that we can take from it, but we can't necessarily just put it on the internet and say, if you're eating ultra-processed foods, you're going to get cancer, or stay away from this food because it's going to cause this or that. The research simply does not show that. So other important factors to consider, as a dietitian who has studied in school something called the social determinants of health, there are a lot of other factors to consider in this conversation because of the varying factors that contribute to health and disease development. And because of this, we can't just pin the development of these diseases on the ultra-processed foods. Again, correlation doesn't equal causation, and we'll get through it in a second. But I just want to list out some of the social determinants of health so you can understand what are the other factors that actually make up your health that have the potential to actually increase your risk of disease development or decrease that risk. So variations of income, education level, family support, health behaviors like nutrition, movement, all of that kind of stuff, environmental factors like where you live, for example, genetics, access to healthcare, and stress. And there are really, really big sections of these social determinants of health that have a high impact on disease development that we need to talk about. So to dive into this a little bit more of why we cannot take this research and conclude that the ultra-processed foods themselves are causing that potential risk, increased risk of disease development, I'm going to give a couple of examples to help us zoom out and get the full picture instead of honing in on one research article, one person on Instagram, and getting freaked out and spooked about these foods. So number one, the people that might eat majority ultra-processed foods, they might live in a place that's called a food desert. So a food desert is essentially a place where you don't have access to a grocery store with fresh produce or a lot of items. So when you live in a food desert, you are at least probably a good hour or more away from a near grocery store. So that means that your closest available food could be a McDonald's and a gas station convenience store. And we know that that's very limited diet variety, number one. So that provides a very much of a limitation environmentally in order to get in a good variety of nutrition. And when we think about those who live in a food desert, we can also draw assumptions that they are living in probably a very rural or underserved community, and they probably don't have access or easy access to medical care. And so we know that lack of access to medical care can be is a huge reason why a disease starts to develop, because you're not having that preventative medicine. And so we can see these multiple layers of things that it might be probably contributing to what we see in these studies of increased disease development that aren't just the ultra-processed foods. Second example that I'm going to give. Overall, just a low-income family or low-income populations are probably buying ultra-processed foods because this is the only way that they can actually feed their family that week. So think about it. If you had $20 to buy groceries that week, to feed your family, to feed yourself, to get through the week, would you spend $5 of those dollars getting a pack of baby carrots and some apples that wouldn't even make up a full meal, wouldn't keep you full because they're generally lower calorie, so they don't really fill you up, mostly made up of water and vitamins and minerals that don't really get you the sustenance to get through the day? Or would you spend that money on things like packaged foods, frozen foods, food items that are more of like that meal or higher calorie food items in order to actually keep your child fed for the week? How would you spend your money? We have to be strategic here. These people have to be strategic. With that being said, there are more important factors to consider about this kind of family's nutrition than the fact that they're consuming ultra-processed foods, right? So they have a lack of food variety. They also don't have access to a lot of fresh produce, so they are missing out on those micronutrients. So there's a lot of other factors nutritionally outside the ultra-processed foods claim that might be contributing to their state of health. But other things that we can consider with low-income families is that they have a lot more things that they're worried about, a lot more things that are against them that are contributing to their overall health. So maybe you have a single mom or single dad household where they are working several jobs at a time, working their butts off just to maybe get food on the table every night and maybe pay rent this month. Think about the unbearable amounts of stress that this person is going through. And we have a lot of extensive research on the effects of stress and disease development. We know that stress on the body is not a good thing for our health. Again, to emphasize that there are other factors that are actually contributing to disease development and the subjects that we might see in the studies that are presented than the ultra-processed foods causing the disease development. I know that's a lot to wrap our heads around. I hope that made sense. I want to touch on the claims of quote-unquote toxic chemicals and the fears around, well, we have ingredients that are banned in other countries, because I'm not going to dive extremely deep into it because there's a pretty general conversation that I want to have around it, but I just want to open our minds to the idea that these terms are just fear-mongering tactics that a lot of people use online, and they're not something to be afraid of in your day-to-day life. Number one, most of the people online pointing at these foods and saying, oh, they have a long list of ingredients that you can't even pronounce. This stuff is toxic. This has so many chemicals in it. They don't even know the ingredient that they're talking about. Half the time, it's vitamins and minerals. It's just the fancy name for them. But the other half of the time, they don't understand basic toxicology. So toxicology is basically, when substances are studied to understand if or when they become toxic. And specifically, we want to study that to make sure it's not toxic to the human body. So they are not understanding basic toxicology principles and understandings, which specify that there are specific doses that deem an ingredient or an additive or whatever chemical, quote unquote, it is, that deem it toxic. There are countless ingredients that are feared because they cause cancer, quote unquote, or they do X, Y, and Z negative effect to your body. But what toxicology is trying to point out here is that the dose creates the poison. Yes, there are lots of ingredients that are shown to maybe have adverse health effects on us, but this would be at a dosage that is basically impossible for you to consume. So what I mean by this is you would have to eat an unfathomable amount of the food with that ingredient in it every day for an extended period of time in order for the body to actually accumulate that much of that ingredient or quote unquote chemical to potentially start to experience negative health effects. I hope that makes sense because this is such an important principle that I think is going to relieve a lot of stress for you. In addition, I want to mention too that a lot of the people that are utilizing this fear around toxic chemicals and all these processed ingredients are the very same people trying to sell you a greens powder, energy powders and protein powders and other supplements that, number one, are some of the most processed things that you can consume. Again, not that it's negative, but those are processed foods with a ton of weird ingredients in it. Number two, supplements, these kind of things, they aren't even regulated by the Food and Drug Administration or the FDA. They aren't even regulated to be approved for safety by our very organization that deems foods as safe. So people can sell you a greens powder and not actually fully disclose the ingredients that are in it, and not actually disclose if it's gotten tested for unsafe levels or toxic levels of certain ingredients. And so these are the same people that are telling you to not eat Oreos, but are promoting their greens powder with we don't actually know what's in it, right? There is a double standard to be considered in this conversation. There's a lot of fear mongering going on. A lot of the buzz around this online is because people are utilizing fear-mongering in order to get you to buy into their product. So they're telling you, don't eat this. This is so bad for you, but here's my healthy option. Go ahead and buy this. This will make you stop bloating. This will improve your health. Whatever claims that they're having, that is just a marketing tactic, and I don't want you to fall for that. Lastly, I want to briefly touch on the claim ingredients that we have ingredients in the US that are banned in other countries and the fear around this, because I hear this so much. And I just want to point out, well, I don't know the long list of banned ingredients off the top of my head. I want to empower you to know that there's a double standard going on here as well, because there is a list of ingredients that are actually not allowed in the US, that are banned in the US, that are used in other countries. So it's happening both ways. So for example, like in Europe, people are saying how quote unquote clean the food is there. There are tons of ingredients that are actually banned in the US that they use in their food. So it's both ways. You can't make that claim And the people who are making those claims, they also don't know, they don't understand what ingredients they're talking about. So that's why whenever I hear that claim, I immediately dismiss it because you don't know what you're talking about. All this to say, you guys, that ultra-processed foods, they can be very helpful. They play very helpful roles in many people's lives. They can be a very easy, convenient way to get in very much needed nutrition. Number one of my favorite ones to bring up are fortified foods. So things like fortified cereals, breads, pastas, all of the carb foods that people are fearing and telling you not to eat, they're often fortified with really helpful nutrients that in order to help the population meet those nutrient needs. So for example, cereal, which is one of my favorite foods, is fortified with folic acid and iron. Folic acid specifically is super duper important during pregnancy and growing the baby. And iron, especially if you have more of a plant-based diet and you're not eating animal sources of iron, eating things like cereal is actually really going to help you have enough of that micronutrient. And so we can't be so quick to diss and eliminate these foods because they're quote unquote processed or ultra processed. They are very nutritious. They provide good nutrition to your body. Additionally, they can be very convenient. Eating something is always better than nothing. If you don't take away anything else from this, I want you to know if you struggle with food and you don't know what to eat today and you feel afraid of foods and you think, I might as well just not eat what I have because all I have is a cup of mac and cheese. No, eat the mac and cheese. It doesn't matter that it doesn't have all the other components of a well-balanced meal. Eat the mac and cheese. Sometimes ultra-processed foods and packaged foods are convenient for us and they help us actually eat and nourish our bodies today. That mac and cheese, your body can use that mac and cheese to produce needed energy to get you through the day. Whereas if you just skipped that meal, your body wouldn't have that energy to use. So processed foods are very convenient and also they're very enjoyable. There are tons of processed foods that are super enjoyable and add to your life, add to the enjoyment of your day and of your life. And so why take that joy away because some random person online in a grocery store picked up a box of crackers and told you this is going to give you cancer when they don't even know what they're talking about and they're trying to sell you their fancy greens powder that's unregulated. Anyways, I will stop myself from going on a huge rant about that and go ahead and touch on how I want to challenge you to think about this conversation differently as a Christian, as somebody who knows the Bible, as somebody who walks with Jesus and loves the Lord. I'm going to bring up 1 Kings 19, a passage in there where essentially it's talking about Elijah and his long trip that he's on, and he just gets super physically and mentally drained to the point of asking the Lord to die. Like he is mentally and physically unwell. He wants to give up. And so in this passage, I'll read it for you, but he actually ends up taking a nap. The Lord provides him food and something to drink a couple of times. And so he gets a nap, he gets food, he gets drink, and he gets re-energized. His mental space is so much clearer, and he's able to push on and press on with the journey that the Lord has for him. And I think that there's a lot of things that we can talk about in this. So I'm going to read it really quick. So I'm just starting at verse 3. And if you feel like you want more context, go ahead and read more of the book yourself. But Elijah was afraid and ran for his life. When he came to Beersheba in Judah, he left his servant there, while he himself went on a day's journey into the wilderness. He came to a broom bush, sat down under it, and prayed that he might die. I have had enough, Lord, he said. Take my life. I am no better than my ancestors. Then he lay down under the bush and fell asleep. At once an angel touched him and said, Get up and eat. He looked around, and there by his head was some bread baked over hot coals and a jar of water. He ate and drank and then lay down again. The angel of the Lord came back a second time and touched him and said, "Get up and eat, for the journey is too much for you." So he got up and ate and drank. Strengthened by that food, he traveled 40 days and 40 nights until he reached Oreb, the mountain of God. So, number one, I apologize if I mispronounced any of those names. But again, what we can take from this is that Elijah was super worn down, and it was God's idea to give him bread. And in some other translations, it is cake, by the way. Just want to mention that, which is super cool. Either way, he's giving him some carbs, some processed carbs in order to fuel his journey, because God knows what your body needs. He also gives him some water and some sleep, some rest, which is a discussion for another time. But those three things fueled him for his journey ahead, which is so cool. God cared for him in the smallest ways, and he knew what he needed. Another verse that I want to bring to our attention is 1 Timothy 4:4. And it says, "For everything God created is good, and nothing is to be rejected if it is received with thanksgiving." And then going to Ecclesiastes, there's actually a couple verses, I think in Ecclesiastes 2 and 3. Don't quote me on that. I forgot to write them down. But that talk about food and drink being a gift from God and to be received with joy, and to just enjoy your life, enjoy food and drink, and enjoy this gift from God. So we know that it's a gift. And we know from 1 Timothy 4:4 that everything God created is good. Food and drink is a good thing. And we know that as beings created in the image of God, we are creative, just like God is. And I think that God delights in our creativity to form foods, process foods, find ways to process food for safe consumption, for convenient consumption, to nourish our population, and also to have pleasure in it, to take pleasure in. I think that it's super cool that people all around the world can enjoy things like ice cream, one of my favorites. They can enjoy those textures and flavors because somebody figured out how to put those ingredients together to create something like ice cream. I don't think that that is a bad thing. I think that God delights in the creativity that it took to create such a thing, and that he does delight when we sit and enjoy that. He does delight when things like foods bring people together. And I think that he delights in whoever made processed foods a thing so that a family made in God's image can feed their children and keep them alive. So I just think that it's so important to look at this differently as believers, and also not to be so fixated on things like this to where it becomes an obsession and anxiety. Part of my disordered eating story is that I began to really show orthorexic tendencies. And so what orthorexia is basically when you're honing in on things like ingredients and the specific, parts of the food that could be unhealthy, and just trying to be super healthy where you overexercise and you limit a bunch of foods because they're not healthy, quote unquote. That fixation is drawing you away from God. This is drawing you away from enjoying his creation of food and the inspiration that he gave people to create yummy foods. Fixating on these things is just not necessary. God created people like food scientists in order to study this for you so that you didn't have to be your own food scientist. You have other things to worry about, friend. You have so many other things to do with your life than to be your very own food scientist, dietitian, whoever else, and do everything else that God is calling you to. Please rest from the stress of this. Please rest from the stress of this. That is what you are called to do as a Christian with this topic, is to rest from the stress of all of this buzz around processed foods and ultra processed foods, and know the truth that we just talked about with the research and understanding fear mongering and marketing tactics to get you to buy in. Have more of that clear headspace around these things so that you can enjoy food move on with your life and do the things that God has for you. Okay, friend, this ended up being a very long episode, but there was a lot to get into, and I feel like I just even scratched the surface of some of this conversation, but I hope that you feel a little bit more understanding of the research and of the things to consider with the research so that you can make more empowering educational decisions on what works for you and your body and for your mind around these things. And so if you, again, are new to me, I would love for you not only to continue checking in on this podcast, and give it a rate if you can. If you really love this, rate it 5 stars. This really helps push this content out to the people who really need to hear it. But I would love for you to join me in my community on Instagram at overflow.nutrition.dietitian, where I share a lot more food freedom tips and just relatable content, some educational points, things like that. I show up there more often, so I would love for you to join us there. And also feel free to check out my website at www.overflownutrition.org to read more about my business and how I might be able to support you on your journey to God-honoring food freedom. I hope that you have a blessed rest of your day wherever you are, and love you already, and I will see you next time.